you get groomed in this business. You go to a high-end white shoe university, then you are either you take the tech path through Google, or you take the political path through the Hill, or you take the human rights path through a UN job or through a Gongo, government operated NGO. And then you get credentialed through the think tanks. You get your fellowships at Carnegie or Atlantic Council or Brookings. And then by that point, the woman you marry is probably, a blob creature. The people you're hanging out with on weekends are blob creatures. Everything, your news sources are all blob publications, and nary a hit piece will ever be written about you in the New York Times or the Washington Post. Every golden turd you lay on the sidewalk will be deified as being, abstract art instead of an actual piece of crap. I can see why there is so little dissent within the blob.
Jumping right into it, what's the history of censorship? What's the history of the censorship industrial complex? People know it exists. People got a sense of it. After hearing you talk, I didn't realize it was this bad, but you are kind of the expert on this. So why don't you talk us through the history of censorship, censorship industrial complex and how it works?
Yeah. So, the easiest way to sort of understand the history of censorship on the internet is to first understand the history of freedom on the internet. A lot of people look at censorship as one of the reasons it's such a blasphemous anti-American thing isn't just because of the First Amendment, but because the internet itself was the beacon of American outsourcing of free speech values for 25 years. It had internet free speech had a lot of money and power pumped behind it for the 25 years before internet censorship came around. So, the internet started as this military project by DARPA, basically to help manage social science research and counterinsurgency to help run the American empire overseas during the Vietnam era, and a way of digitizing that. And then when the Cold War ended, 1991, it was privatized through the World Wide Web. The DARPA handed the internet over to the National Science Foundation, who then basically spread this infrastructure across the universities, and then it was opened up to the private sector. But the private sector was given sort of a steroidal injection, Super Mario Brothers mushroom boost from the national security state in the form of the State Department, the Defense Department, the CIA, and the NSA, all juicing the internet commerce and internet tracking through basically government money. So I'll give you an example. We had something called Voice of America in the 1940s and 50s. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia. There were hundreds of these CIA proprietary media stations that the national security state would pipe in after World War II ended for soft power influence over countries around the world, as radio was becoming a saturating medium of news. And so this helped get foreign populations around the world hooked on American news, American interests. We could seed stories there, true or false. American cultural icons. We could dominate culture, politics, economic policy, foreign policy by basically getting a whole population to read our propaganda. There was a catch-up period in radio and in TV during the 20th century, and when the internet came out, it was one of these new Voice of America type things. This is one of the reasons that the Pentagon spent hundreds of millions of dollars developing internet free speech technology, VPNs, virtual private networks, to hide your IP address, Tor, the darknet, to be able to buy and sell goods or trade or do sort of commerce in the dark, and avoiding government monitoring of what you're doing, and encrypted chats. All of these things came out of Pentagon funds to help the State Department and the CIA back dissident groups in foreign countries whose governments we were trying to overthrow. So free speech was a meme. Free speech online was a meme that was championed by our diplomacy, defense, intelligence nexus, State Department, Defense Department, CIA, NSA, in order to maintain and advance the American empire from 1991 until 2016. Really, it's 2014. We can get into the weeds of how this all started, I guess, now. But
so real quick, you're saying that things like VPNs and Tor that we tend to think of as, hiding from the government or anti-government were actually developed by agencies or by,
to promote in other places open communications, ability to disseminate democracy and democratic, all this stuff. Yeah.
Right. Now, there are terms like open society, for example, that George Soros and Open Society Foundation, and these aren't just terms from influential, eccentric billionaires. These were ideologies embraced at the highest levels of the federal government and of our national security state, because an open society, its media being open, its cultural influences being open, its markets being open, allows the United States, and I'm not even knocking this necessarily. Mm-hmm. I like to be sort of as careful as I can in this, because I'm not sure that I had a problem with this until it all came home. But the fact is open societies are easy to pry open. Closed ones are not. This is why the State Department is so quick to yell shrill insults about authoritarian societies when they box out Google, or when they box out Voice of America or some State Department funded NGO. We call it authoritarian, but if any other country were to do that here, they would be shipped out of the country on a cart so fast you couldn't blink first. I mean, we shut down the internet, on this Russiagate craziness around just Russia Today having a Twitter account, and Sputnik, having viral articles on Facebook. I mean, that was enough. It wasn't even NGOs filled with tens of millions of dollars of, Russian Federation money. So, but that's our game that we play abroad. And so, the internet censorship story is sort of the flip side of that. It's what happens when rigging democratic outcomes through freedom goes wrong. The problem is after 25 years of internet maturity, with social media essentially allowing over time ordinary civilians and citizen journalists and post accounts to grow in size unfettered over time, and the market essentially validating them over mainstream news, means that the traditional cutouts that the national security state, the federal government, the foreign policy establishment all have to be able to influence society are actually pale in comparison. And you start having this weird situation, as 4-star General John Allen said at a German Marshall Fund conference in 2019, what happens when the New York Times is reduced to a medium-sized Facebook page? I mean, he was arguing that the rules-based international order will fall apart if, Ricky Vaughn is able to have a larger Twitter account than the New York Times. In a sense, they're not totally wrong, but their solution is to destroy every fiber of the social contract that we've had in this country for several centuries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating how that flip happens, and I want to dig into it a little bit. You've talked about this sleight of hand, is how I remember it, sleight of hand around critical infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that all develops?
Oh, it's so dirty. So this has to do with the federal government's entry into the censorship industry business. So after the 2016 election, it was really basically, there was a Philippines election in 2016 that went wrong for the CIA, Brexit went wrong, and the Trump election went wrong, all in the same year. And all of the amazing firepower behind internet freedom coming from the Arab Spring, when all of the Obama administration's adversaries in Middle East, North Africa, all were toppled by Facebook and Twitter revolutions. When it went the opposite way through this internet freedom thing, the foreign policy establishment's spook set, essentially out of the State Department, now the intelligence agencies, went on this world tour around setting up infrastructure to stop so-called, disinformation. Russian disinformation was the initial predicate, because that's how you crack open intelligence agency powers. You need some sort of foreign predicate, a foreign national security threat. Then you set up the infrastructure, and then you switch it. Once it's there, you can just, you've developed the Death Star weapon. Now you can just fire it at any plant. It doesn't matter what the initial premise was. So there was a DHS sub-agency called CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And this thing was initially set up during the height of Russiagate in November 2018 to be able to stop Russian hacking. At the time, there were these allegations that Russia had hacked the DNC servers. It wasn't Seth Rich. It wasn't anything like that. It was the Russians. And they had this firm called CrowdStrike, which was supposedly validating that, although CrowdStrike ended up walking it back a year later, amazingly. But by that point, the agency was already set up. And at the time, cybersecurity was the only offensive term for the federal government to be able to act in cyber, cyber takedown activity. So cybersecurity at that time in 2018 meant things like malware, phishing, various forms of hacking attacks. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But what happened was, after Russiagate fell apart in the summer of 2019, they were already teaming up to stop Russian disinformation because of basically a CIA op starting in January 2017 to paint the social media as being inundated with Russian bots and trolls. All of this, again, turned out to be dog water. But what happened was CISA, this DHS agency, set up all these relations with the social media companies, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, even the minor ones like Twitch, Discord, all to have these government affairs folks and these content moderation teams work with CISA to stop and to censor and to ban Russian narrative, pro-Russian narratives, anti-NATO narratives, basically right-wing populist accounts, and a little bit of left-wing populist accounts like the Corbynites in the UK and some of the early Bernie Sanders supporters before he, turned completely to the dark side, if you will. But essentially what happened was they did this multi-front switcheroo. They said, okay, well, Russiagate fell apart, but really Russian disinformation pales in comparison to the threat of domestic disinformation at home. They went from a sort of national security predicate on the Russia side to a democracy predicate at home. And this was buoyed by nonstop media memery of the term democracy, 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 and disinformation, disinformation, disinformation. They sort of blew up the gravity of this thing to where it sucked everything into it, and it allowed it to be very easy for government agencies to say, oh, we're advancing the principles that are so hot right now in the news. And then the other thing they did is they said cybersecurity actually includes cyber disinformation and misinformation threats. And this was the real dirty one, because this allowed them to say that cybersecurity doesn't just mean hacking. It also means misinformation about critical infrastructure, because DHS has a license to take on threats to critical infrastructure. So they declared elections to be critical infrastructure, and they declared public health to be critical infrastructure. So by declaring elections to be critical infrastructure, if you as a civilian say that you think there's election fraud with mail-in ballots, that was deemed to be delegitimization, which was said to be a cyber attack on the critical infrastructure of elections, because you are undermining the perceived legitimacy of elections, and this is essentially an attack on democracy, and it's an attack on elections themselves. And so, literally, DHS set up this cutout called the Election Integrity Partnership, which got 22 million tweets labeled as misinformation, and they were working in coordination with DHS. They were set up by DHS So you have this situation where DHS basically banned 22, that's just on Twitter alone. They did this for 15 different platforms. That's hundreds of millions of pieces of content at the height of a highly contested US election, completely banned. And not only that, the accounts often get banned along with it. So you've rigged the entire information ecosystem by doing this switcheroo around cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's crazy. It's like they set up both the object, essentially making somebody like you go to a power plant, you plant a bomb, you blow that up. You're doing the same thing if you say something about elections, being the power plant, and the bomb is just maybe you asking a question online.
And they knew this too. One of the main guys behind this, a guy named Alex Stamos, who's the head of something called the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is basically a giant CIA cutout. I mean, the whole thing is mobbed up with spooks like you wouldn't believe. And he's on tape talking about how at the time all we really had was the word cybersecurity to do all this stuff, so we had to really jam it in there. But one day these will probably formally be known as separate fields. We just don't have the political clout essentially to do it yet. So they knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing the whole time. As early as 2017, when all this stuff was getting started, even before the censorship infrastructure connecting the government to the private sector, to the civil society institutions, to the news media and fact checking, before that whole of society quadrant was set up, they knew what they were doing. I mean, these people are all on tape at Atlantic Council conferences, which is a big NATO cutout. It's got 7 CIA directors on its board. It had a formal partnership with Burisma. It's a whole nastygram of sort of Biden intelligence world intrigue. And in February 2017, they were having these conferences talking about the need to establish a sort of Russia connection that would eventually be used, because the public wasn't ready. You boil the frog type stuff. Also, State Department people going to Europe and pressuring them to adopt censorship regulations like NetzDG in Germany in August 2017, knowing that America couldn't do that yet. You have these diplomats saying this openly in these public conferences that if Europe leads, America will follow through norms and standards the laws that are adopted in Europe, and also these European laws will compel these norms and standards and practices on the censorship side that will have to be glommed on over to the US for market continuity. Things like AI censorship. So things that were real game changers, because before 2016, you couldn't even censor the internet at the scale you do now, because everything was human moderated other than child porn and spam. But there was no speech related AI pre-censorship. But now every word you speak, if this goes up on YouTube, every single word we're saying right now is going into thousands of trust and safety layers, parsing every word, parsing the proximity of words to one another to scan for terms and phrases that are deemed to be borderline content or that are basically proxies for populist political support.
Yeah. So was the singular event that triggers this into overdrive the 2020 election, or you mentioned 2014 earlier? What dates do you see as critical? Kind of trigger things.
I would say, it became a military thing in 2014, and what happened in 2016 was a follow-on of the military lead from 2014. So basically, in 2014, you had the great failure of the Obama administration in Ukraine. There was this long-range plan from the State Department around bringing Ukraine into the NATO Euro-Atlantic axis. There was a more or less unimpeded string of W's from the foreign policy establishment from 1991 to 2014, which came to a screeching halt when there was a counter coup from the Russian side to the coup from the US, UK side. For folks who aren't familiar, you had this democratically elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, who, the State Department sort of painted as this Russian agent Putin pawn, which is, frankly, that's nonsense. Yanukovych was signing oil and gas deals with U.S. energy companies, Shell, Halliburton, Chevron, Exxon, all of these had multi-billion-dollar deals with the Ukrainian government there. But basically, NATO tried to twist their arm. The IMF tried to twist their arm. They went with a Russian trade deal. Victoria Nuland, Jeff Pyatt swoop in. They, summoned the right sector. We pumped $5 billion of civil society cash into these rent-a-riot mobs. They overthrow Yanukovych, install Yatsenyuk. I mean, literally install, no election. We just picked their president. And then, a funny thing happened on the way to a color revolution. The Luhansk and Donetsk broke off, declared themselves independent, not subject to the new Kiev government. And Crimea not only broke off, but then it independently voted to join the Russian Federation. And this was something that neither NATO nor the State Department was prepared for there to be a military backstop by Russia of basically splitting in half the crown jewel country of multi-decade NATO plan. And when this happened, there was a panic that set in that the NATO had lost its soft power projection magic that had existed basically from 1947 onward, which is to say that these people in eastern Ukraine voluntarily broke off from NATO because of their own internal beliefs, their own media influences. That is, there was $5 billion of National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, State Department, NGO swarm money pumped into Ukraine to control its media, to control its hearts and minds, but none of it worked. None of it worked in eastern Ukraine, at least. Now, a lot of that is because of the Russian ethnic, disposition over there. But the fact is this set in motion a doctrine. At the time, it was called the Gerasimov Doctrine. You can sort of get into some of the technical details if you want. But it eventually came to be called hybrid warfare, which is this idea that NATO needs to start looking at war less as about conventional weapons and more about control over people's minds. And this eventually got codified in this term that would be bandied about called "from tanks to tweets," which was this doctrine that Jens Stoltenberg did like a dozen speeches on. It was in the NATO 2030 blueprint. They paraded around this whole thing that NATO has to focus less on tanks. Now, again, this is all before 2022. This is from 2014 until, this was the critical period, by the way, where censorship was set up. I mean, what happened after 2022 is an afterthought compared to, in fact, 2022 was sort of the moment things turned in the other direction, from the house flipping, from Elon Musk taking over Twitter, from a bunch of lawsuits that we might get to. But by that point, this military focus on dominating hearts and minds had already had billions of dollars pumped into it. It's hilarious how this thing got promoted. It's almost like how, if you're a zoologist and you want to get government grant money to study squirrels, you just put a line in there about how, climate change is like a subject of study for your squirrel mating habits. And you'll get approved because you said the magic word climate change. Well, the same thing started to happen all across the federal government with hybrid warfare. Whether you were in psychology or sociology or computer science, whether you were at Rand Corporation or whether you were a DARPA researcher, or whether you were trying to get matching funds as a corporation for corporate social responsibility. If you just put in that term hybrid warfare, it got to the point where you had these NATO conferences where people would apologize for using the term because it was so played out. But it had a very deadly double meaning, which was that you no longer had this presupposition of a civilian-run media. You had military top-down control, military top-down influence doctrinally. I mean, you had as a first principle this idea that there was now a military need to control the media. And this started between 2014 and 2016 in Central and Eastern Europe. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, the whole Baltics, Ukraine, all the way up through Germany. a massive investment in these things called centers of excellence, NATO centers of excellence, Stratcom, strategic communications, all to build psychological resilience. And this basically involved just censoring the ever-loving crap out of anyone who was spewing anti-NATO talking points, or most nefariously, who was supporting the political candidates in those countries who were deemed to be populist or not down with the foreign policy establishment. The classic example of this is Germany. After the migrant crisis, 2013, 2015, in Germany, there was a huge explosion in popularity of a political party called the Alternative for Deutschland, or AfD. Now, AfD was this sort of, working class, sort of lower middle class, very similar to sort of MAGA, types in the US or Brexiteers in the UK, similar in a lot of ways. And they were basically running as a platform on cheap energy through Russian gas pipelines. At the time, Nord Stream 2 was this big matching natural gas pipeline that was going to double the natural gas supply from Gazprom, Russia, deepen the relations between Germany and Russia. NATO was going the 100% opposite way. They had this whole Grand Ukraine energy play, prying off Russia, nuking Russia's gas exports down to zero. And so there was this whole proxy war playing out in Germany around essentially the CIA, the State Department, the NGO swarm, everything they could to subvert AfD and all of its political proxies, all of its pro-AfD media news stations, pro-AfD social media accounts. I mean, you had U.S. taxpayer-funded NGOs having public conferences about how to stop domestic meddling in Germany's own elections. I mean, the people would have the temerity to influence their own elections. This is what our own State Department is saying. But, this was when Brexit happened in 2016. It came to the UK, and when the Trump election happened in the US, in short order, that was the final straw. Mm-hmm. NATO had enough. The US State Department had enough. The CIA had enough. The UK Foreign Office had enough. Brussels had enough. Enough of free speech. We need to shut the internet down, essentially. And so everything swung the opposite direction, and we're living in the aftermath of that.
It's an insane time. I mean, there's an article, we'll link it in the show notes. It's called What Happened in 2012, and it tracks the kind of cataclysmic chain of events that come about after smartphone adoption goes through the roof in 2012. It goes from like in 2010, it's like a smartphone adoption is like, I don't know, 20% of the population, maybe 8% of the population. 2012, it reaches something like 80% of the population. And then you have Brexit, you have Ukraine issues, you have 2016 election. It seems like it's a time where the powers that be, NATO and others, are having to reckon with the onslaught of these new technologies and the consequences that you said earlier. There's a panic. They don't know what the unintended effects of these things are going to be.
And there was a real sense at the time, like post 2016, especially on the left side, of saying we need to do whatever it takes to prevent these types of things from happening again. Like whatever needs to happen, that's the work that we need to put in over the next few years. And they did, obviously, coming up to 2020. But what's happened, with the suppression of all the information around the election, but that seems to me like kind of the peak. What's happened in the intervening years since that time?
Well, the infrastructure was all set up. Do you mean between 2014 and 2022?
Between 2020 and present day.
Oh, well, there was a wave, because right now there's really the first successful counteroffensive going on. I would say that, look, they're coming back. This is going to be a battle that will last well beyond the rest of our lives. It's never over, and it's in certain respects it's still getting worse. But there have been many things that have happened in the past 12 months. I would say the high watermark to date of the censorship industry is like March, April 2022. From between 2020 and spring of 2022, it was the codification and the complete normalization of all the censorship infrastructure that was set up between 2018 and 2020. So a great example of this is CISA, this DHS censorship agency we were talking about. They ran the censorship of the 2020 election out of a subunit called the Countering Foreign Influence Task Force. Now, the Countering Foreign Influence Task Force was specifically, explicitly directed around censoring U.S. citizen lawful opinions about the 2020 election. They targeted everyone from James O'Keefe to Mark Levin to Don Jr. To friggin' Cat Turd. They had Cat Turd on a list. And it was called the Countering Foreign Influence Task Force. Now, they knew at the time this was dirty business, and they didn't have the predicate to do it. They actually talked about setting up this cutout EIP because they, quote, lacked the funding and the legal authorities to do it directly out of DHS's Countering Foreign Influence Task Force. They knew they didn't have the legal authority. Now, the first week Biden takes office on January 20th, 2016, or 2020. The first week, DHS changes the name of that office from the Office of Countering Foreign Influence, from the Countering Foreign Influence Task Force to the Office of Mis, Dis, and Malinformation. So they retroactively paper over the fact that they didn't have a predicate to do this domestically, even though in October 2020, 1 month before the 2020 election, at their own disinformation conference, they talked about how their focus should be 80% domestic, 20% foreign. They said, right now we're focused on 80% foreign, 20% domestic. We need to flip that because the fire is coming from inside the house. 80% domestic. 80% domestic, and yet they were still calling it the Countering Foreign Influence Task Force. But 1 week after Biden takes office, they correct that. They paper it over. So now, as the Office of Mis, Dis, and Malinformation, generally, all things wrong or perceived to be wrong or just troublesome on the internet are now at the jurisdiction of this Ministry of Truth within, the ministry we set up to stop another 9/11. And so, that happened in 2020. You had a lot of political predicate to stop extremism between January 2021 and 2022 because of the January 6th stuff. So you had this whole sort of normalization of censorship of domestic voices from the January 6th stuff. And then as that started to run out of steam a little bit, and as more things came to light about what was actually going on and how the sausage was being made, you had this turning of the tide. You had in April 2022, you had the Disinformation Governance Board attempt to be set up within DHS. The fact that was killed within a week because the sort of sleeping giant of Republican neuroses was somehow, awakened. I mean, it's kind of hilarious if you think about it, because the Ministry of Truth was set up in November 2018. The Disinformation Governance Board wasn't a Ministry of Truth. In a sense, the opponents of Jim Jordan and Chuck Grassley were sort of correct there. It was just this dull, boring, bureaucratic layer to manage the sprawling Ministry of Truth that had already been set up. But because it wasn't given a boring name like Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, because they were dumb enough to call it a name vaguely echoing what it actually does, suddenly everyone was aware, oh my God, there's a government role in censorship. Now, I've been screaming my plastered face off about this for 5 years, and somehow it took an event like that to catalyze, government awareness of internet censorship. But you had that, and then in short succession, Elon Musk, Deus Ex Machina, $44 billion falls out of the sky to free the largest social media platform. You have the Twitter files exposés. You have multiple lawsuits from the state attorney general's office in Missouri and Louisiana against the Biden administration, specifically on First Amendment grounds on censorship. You have the America First legal federal class action case on free speech. You have the Republicans winning the House in November 2022, which opens the floodgates, 8 different congressional committees, House Judiciary, House Oversight, Weaponization, House Homeland Security Committee, Science, Space, and Technology, House Foreign Affairs, Energy and Commerce, and Senate Homeland Security. All of these have independently done their own investigations, hauled people in for transcribed interviews, subpoenas, basically sunlight disinfecting many of these institutions that had operated, I'm not exaggerating, for 6 or 7 years with zero friction to their operations in terms of transparency. While these people were all, parading in the media about the need for platform transparency, while themselves they were shielding everything. They were having these direct cahoots, censorship coordination with the federal government, and then arguing that they shouldn't have to turn those over in FOIA requests or even in subpoenas. So, these are people who operate in a cloak and dagger fashion. They're shrouded by Orwellian doublespeak words, and that prevent the public from really piercing what they actually do. But the good thing is now there is a really organized counteroffensive to pry that open. The only question is how much will they raise the stakes to subvert that? What they're doing with the Justice Department right now with these indictments and, has upped the level in a way that I don't think people anticipated a couple of years ago.
Yeah, there's so much there. Part of it, something that strikes me as you've been saying it, is there's a department of, the State Department, and then there's a subcommittee, and then that has its own subcommittee or its own subsection or subsection, and then you have this sort of Russian nesting doll situation where departments within departments within departments are the ones driving monstrous policy that affect just everybody's lives. Talk a little bit about that mechanism. Like how does that work? Why is that mentality there of like, let's start another subcommittee and subcommittee and subcommittee? Is part of the goal there to cloak it, to hide it?
So if we're talking about the structure of institutional consensus building, there's a concept I come back to time and again called the Blob. This is a term from Ben Rhodes, who was Obama's deputy national security advisor, and he used this to describe the foreign policy establishment. This is this diplomacy, defense, intelligence nexus: State Department, Pentagon, CIA, plus the all the NGOs and all their little funded cutouts and shell entities, essentially. Now, this apparatus, the Blob, was set up essentially in 1947, 1948, very early on, as a sort of conjoining of the State Department, the Pentagon, and the CIA to be able to coordinate our management of the American empire. So the American empire is much bigger than the American homeland. There's only 300 million people here. The amount of citizens around the world who are subject essentially to the American empire, even during World War II, our empire, we became a global empire in 1898. The Philippines and the Spanish-American War and Cuba and Latin America was basically under our fold since the early 1800s with the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, and then when the Marshall Plan kicked off in the 1948, basically Europe became a part of the American empire, and so we needed this coordinating apparatus within the federal government to manage the different levers of soft power control abroad. So I like to think of them as being conjoined, and these people all rotate jobs. If you've got a job in an intelligence agency or in a feeder to it, in an NGO feeder to an intelligence agency, you're eligible for a job at the State Department or Pentagon's, civil affairs type stuff immediately. It's the same skill set. It's just a slightly different focus. So there is a consensus building architecture for getting defense, diplomacy, and intelligence all aligned. And that also includes their stakeholders in private industry, Chamber of Commerce, the energy sector, the military contractors, the banking and finance, the Goldman Sachs type and BlackRock type investors. Those are all what I call the donors and drafters off of the national security state. So a great example of this is George Soros. So Soros made his money basically being a partner of the State Department as we were prying open Central and Eastern Europe during the Cold War in the 1980s. His Open Society foundations were essentially the civil society arm of NATO and the State Department and the UK Foreign Office to be able to get tens of thousands of people in a region on payroll, get these rent-a-riots with student groups and young people who would provide the muscle to be able to, bum rush a parliament building to kick a president out, or to be able to shut down government buildings if an authoritarian wasn't, doing a trade deal that the U.S. government wanted. And so, but Soros was speculating. At the same time, he was running a New York hedge fund that speculated on the currencies of Central and Eastern European governments. So it was basically an insider trading operation where you have this big mega banker who's got inside knowledge and has helped instrumentalizing the regime change of a foreign country while betting on that country's currency, knowing the direction it will go 10 months before the market does. Now, you see the same phenomenon happen everywhere. In the natural gas market, Ukraine sits on Europe's second largest shale reserves, totally untapped. If you know that Eastern Ukraine is going to basically free up that, and if you know that Ukraine's natural gas mega giant Naftogaz, which is the public company that's the dominating lion's share of the entire country's revenue, if you know that publicly held company is about to be privatized at gunpoint by the Pentagon and spun off to all these stakeholders who are going to have their investments protected by the CIA, the State Department, the Defense Department, NATO, MI6, the UK Foreign Office, and a pried open German government. If you know those are about to be brand new windfall investments protected at gunpoint by hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer revenue, that's an easy investment. And that's why Chevron and Shell and Halliburton and all of the Cheney and Bush companies and all of the London ones like Shell, they all rushed in with $10 billion investments with the Ukrainian government once it looked like the national security state was going to break the wind for them. So these entities also contribute to the regime change operations. The Chamber of Commerce will pour in money through this CIA cutout, called the Center for International Private Enterprise, run out of the National Endowment for Democracy. You'll have these, and we've been doing this, by the way, since the 1800s in a certain respect. Coca-Cola, was helping. You had these, and United Fruit was doing this too in the 1800s.
Yeah.
Where you have these sort of corporate donors to a national security state operation, but there's a mutual backscratching. The corporate side will provide some assistance funding and provide some capital. It's almost like you're bringing in an investment with it. You have an anchor investor in the form of the U.S. government, but then you bring in all of these sort of follow-on investors, and what they get in return is a captive market because now everybody in that country is eating McDonald's. I mean, this is a funny thing about McDonald's and pizza. There's a really funny ad that everybody who's watching this should look up. The Gorbachev Pizza Hut ad in the early 90s. The moment Russia fell into the U.S. empire after the Cold War ended, and the State Department and the CIA all descended on Russia. We did shock therapy. We privatized $2 trillion in assets and went straight to the Harvard endowment and to the Wall Street and London investors. And like the most iconic scene from that is this ad that Gorbachev himself shot for Pizza Hut with, about how now Pizza Hut had finally come to, 200 million Russians, but think about that as a equity stakeholder in Pizza Hut. You now have at the barrel of a NATO gun, 200 million new customers, and especially for high margin businesses in the energy sphere. So you have this consensus building. To bring this back, you have this consensus building process, and this is what they think democracy is. We think of democracy as you and I voting. For them, it's a cumbersome enough process to get all the institutions into a democratic alignment. How do you get the energy companies? How do you get the military contractors? How do you get the Chamber of Commerce companies? How do you get the State Department careers? How do you get the CIA operations division? How do you get the Pentagon and the National Security people? How do you get them all to vote on what you're doing in a region? What are you going to do with Belarus? How are you going to handle Ukraine? What are you going to do in the Baltics? To bring these people into alignment requires a consensus building process, both within the government agencies and then outside them through these white shoe think tanks like Brookings or the Atlantic Council or CSIS. Now, these double as being places where people are put on payroll. These people get very cushy sinecures. I'm a resident fellow at the Scowcroft Center of the Atlantic Council, and you just collect your paycheck to basically consensus build with your peers. You're basically paid to propagandize the NATO talking points to your peers so that they are brought into alignment. It's almost like the same way, you come to be a paid, political shill to do your little Instagram post promoting political candidate du jour. These soft power NGOs, which are all funded by the federal government, do the same thing with recruiting essentially an institutional army to make that happen.
Can you talk more about, so you mentioned cutouts before. I think a lot of people are not familiar with that term, but you talk about what are cutouts and how are those formed?
Yeah, cutout is when the government wants to do something, but for either legal or logistical reasons, it can't. And so it has to operate through a puppeteered non-governmental organization. Now, these can take the form of university centers. These can take the form of non-governmental organizations, or what are sometimes called gongos instead of NGOs, government-operated non-governmental organizations. They can also take the form of private firms. This is something that the State Department and the CIA have been doing again since the 1940s. Part of this is because you need to move money through things in order to set these up, and so there's a money laundering process for this. Essentially, I posted a video on this the other day of, I think, a CBS special from the early 1960s showing how sophisticated the shell game already was by the 1960s of the CIA and the State Department when they want to pump up, say, a political group in Nicaragua or Belize. First the CIA or the State Department money goes into an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands or Panama. And then from there, it goes into a nonprofit foundation from some affiliated, from some friendly but non-affiliated group. These are where your Soroses or your Omidyars or your Craig Newmarks, this is where your sort of, oligarchic business owner or philanthropists who work arm in arm with the national security state in this sort of donor and drafter class come from. And then from there, it will go to the NGO of choice. And so this is something we've had, again, there's nothing new about this. It's now in 80 years, we've had this highly sophisticated process for pumping up, they call it capacity building, pumping up the capacity of an organization that can do what you are not allowed or would be logistically inappropriate to do. So, when we want to when the CIA wants to topple a foreign government, we don't march in there with a bunch of W-2 tax forms and badges who say, "Hi, my name is Mike Benz. Don't clip that, but hi, my name is Santiago. I work for the Central Intelligence Agency. How are you?"
Yeah.
There's everything in this world operates through, and by the way, even at the State Department level, this is why we operate through NGOs and university centers and sort of pop-up private sector firms, because it's a diplomatic incident when you are supporting or interfacing with opposition groups within a country who are hostile to that country's government. You can imagine if the Russian Federation, was literally calling itself the Russian Federation, as it was, working with Turning Point USA or something, right? This would they wouldn't dare to do that. Now, look, they don't even do proxy stuff. Even that's an invention of our foreign policy blob to try to create a counterintelligence predicate to censor and abuse us. But the fact is we do that left, right, and center on. I don't think you could spin the globe and find a country where I can't point you to where we do these operations internationally, but we have to do it through cutouts, because even if you were to do it through overt diplomacy, and we do a lot of this actually through overt diplomacy, through our democracy promotion programs, but it's still unsightly. And so most of the swarm, that surround sound, where it looks like there's a consensus in the country because 200 different media outlets are all echoing the same talking points about, oh, this authoritarian abuse by this government. Or, in Ukraine, we had something called the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, where it was 56 different U.S. State Department funded NGOs all working in totally mockingbird fashion to amplify the exact same, sort of talking points around governance, around energy policy, around military policy. But that's basically just the State Department simultaneously playing 56 different string instruments at once. So you need cutouts to operate in this business. That's why there's so many of them.
I was listening to the Rogan Musk interview that came out 2 days ago, and Musk talks about how Twitter, it wasn't just being used, they didn't just have a couple of FBI agents there, giving them some pointers on what to censor, which knobs to turn. He said that it was functionally a branch of the government. That's how bad it was. As a cutout, it makes me think
that it still is among other companies.
And he said like Facebook and all the other ones still are. It's only his own coming in and saying, "Nope, you're not a cutout anymore. This is not my cutout. This is mine." Change the landscape. So on the Musk and X front, do you think his buying Twitter and pumping the brakes on all that is having some meaningful actual change and an effect on the censorship industrial complex?
We know it is. We know it is because, don't take it from me, take it from them. I can't. I've lost track of the wailing and lamentations that have come out, not just in headlines but in long form panel discussions and podcasts. These people in their own internal conversations are apoplectic about it. You saw this when Elon got rid of Aaron Rodgers and the election censorship team, which itself was basically a CIA cutout ring. Aaron Rodgers himself came out of this National Endowment for Democracy incubator. The National Endowment for Democracy is the CIA's premier cutout in the democracy promotion place. Literally, its founder said that they do overtly what the CIA used to do covertly. That's a direct quote from the National Endowment for Democracy's founder. And so Aaron Rodgers came straight from there. He was recruiting these censorship positions directly from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which was run for the past 7 years by Bill Burns, Biden's current director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So Biden's CIA NGO of choice is like where this guy was recruiting from. This guy was openly backing CISA's intelligence apparatus in his own tweets. He was calling Musk himself an effing dipshit on his own Twitter profile. He was promoting Blue Sky and Mastodon in his own Twitter bio. I mean, the guy was a total rogue agent. The head of, but listen, again, you have to understand is like when the censorship technology was created at the AI level and the censorship infrastructure was installed at the institutional level. These things both coincided in 2018. These people thought that they had found El Dorado. They thought they had found, the land of gold to be able to rig every election on the planet. It took like 2 years for 85 different countries all to be wrapped into the National Endowment for Democracy's counter disinformation program. 85 different countries in just 2 years between 2016 and 2018, all being targeted by the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency's top cutout for working with YouTube, working with Facebook, working with Twitter 1.0 to be able to rig elections. I mean, Again, spin the globe. This is like Tanzania, Madagascar. I mean, the most remote regions. I didn't see Antarctica on the list, but it's only a matter of time. And every single one of these, you had the election integrity team, and you can predict it. I mean, you could write an elementary script to be able to predict exactly who they're going to rig in the election. It's whatever populist political group is opposed to the U.S. foreign policy blob. And they did this everywhere. And they thought this was, it's hard enough. In the 20th century, we focused on saturation rather than censorship. Now, there was censorship that was done when the CIA or the State Department would have a relationship with the editorial desk of like Le Monde in France, or the Frankfurt Allgemeiner in Germany. Like, we did have intelligence relations with large distribution news outlets to be able to kill stories. But most of it was about saturating. It was about turning up the knob of U.S. government propaganda, because we didn't have the capacity at the time to reach into the throat of 7 billion citizens and just turn their volume down to zero, like friggin' Ursula from Little Mermaid, just stealing your voice if you expressed support for a candidate who the CIA didn't want to win. Now, again, these people have a license to do this under NSC 10-2 and under the National Security Act of 1947. We have a license to rig elections. It's their civic duty. It's what they were put on this earth to do, is to rig foreign elections. And when the censorship technology through AI, through word embeddings, all you need to do is just, what's the name of the group you're trying to kill politically? What are their memes? What are their slogans? What are their rallying calls? You create this linguistic taxonomy of what the people in that region. That's why we get all these people on payroll to map, what they're saying. We get the foreign language. What are they saying in Swahili to support their candidates in that region? What are they saying in Portuguese to this? So we bring in these university centers to map the linguistic rhetoric, and then we plug those into AI algorithms. So you have this, these sprawling reams of keyword databases. And then you fine tune the sentiment analysis. You create this network map around who the key influences are. And so with that in tow, with a captive team that's liaising with you in the tech companies, you have the perfect formula to be able to, if all you're doing is saturating your own message, it usually works. But sometimes ideology is persistent. Sometimes people just effing hate you. You screwed them over. You stole all their gold. You stole all their oil. You stole their land. You stole their sugar and agriculture crops. These people want you out. So sometimes no amount of propaganda will sway those hearts and minds. But if these people can't even articulate their philosophy, then how are they going to scale it? It's not just, it's Clockwork Orange. There's no ability to even mobilize. All you can see is the government propaganda if you have the censorship weapon. So they roll this out everywhere. And this relies, again, on these two things: the technological capacity to do it through the machine learning AI, and the institutional pass-through of cutout teams. Again, you don't need the whole organization to do this. Zuckerberg did not want to do this. Dorsey did not want to do this. And we can get into that, Google did want to do this, okay? F Google. But most of the tech companies didn't. And they had to have various carrots and sticks. The State Department protected them against Europe between 2018 and 2022. This is a big part of it. The state, they were relying on they were part of this donor drafter class who relied on the battering ram of the national security state to protect their monopolies abroad. And that's a big leverage point to be able to force them to simply capacity build within their just simply set up a new content moderation team that focuses on counterintelligence. It'll interface, with Russian disinformation threats with the intelligence community and with the State Department, or it'll focus on, on content moderation, regulatory affairs. They have so many different ways to shoehorn getting 20 or 30 good people, usually who come straight from the CIA or straight from the FBI or DHS or the State Department or the Pentagon, doing soft power influence jobs, doing counterinsurgency work about molding the hearts and minds of Afghanis or Iraqis. And then they're suddenly at the Facebook equivalent working with the State Department or DHS on how to kill, people who live in Idaho, their opinions on COVID or Ukraine policy or energy policy or immigration policy. They try to scale this to everything. But again, we know that Musk is making a difference because all of the worst people have said it. The Washington Post, the Stanford Internet Observatory, the Biden White House, the Yoel Roth. They are in a regrouping period right now, and they're relying in part on the dividends from what they had set up earlier of government censorship. Right now, a lot of the action is in Europe, in the EU, and this new Digital Services Act, and this panoply of surround sound censorship laws that will compel censorship when pressure through government insinuation or through ad boycotts or through NGO swarms is insufficient. They can bring in a rule of law predicate, which is sort of the final, pogo thing to throw on the card, the final sort of trump card that you can't fight against. That is the thing that is most daunting right now and that they have the most momentum on. That's just really, really hard to fight.
Mike, I'm always astonished at just your deep knowledge of the blob. You came from the State Department, right?
Yes.
So talk to me about let's get into the building blocks of all these institutions, the cutouts, all these things. They're ultimately built by individual people. What causes somebody at the State Department to take the path you take against censorship and against all this? On the flip side, what's the kind of person that goes deep into all of the blob? Talk to me about that difference.
Well, it's easier to talk about the second one because it's a very lonely road on the first one. Probably, some combination of madness and not being hugged enough. I think I had a teacher in high school, I think, who called it obstinate defiance syndrome. So I think it's probably some combination of that and just, it was a weird path. I was monitoring this stuff from very, very early on. I had a chess background as a kid, and I lived through the period where Garry Kasparov lost to Deep Blue and how the idea of chess computers totally shattered the conception of the romantic period of chess as we knew it. And in late 2016, I became obsessive with the technological side of censorship because Google Perspective, there's something called Jigsaw, which was set up essentially by this. It's basically the CIA wing of Google, and in late 2016 they rolled out this AI retail censorship product that worked just like chess computers, and you could go onto it and you could plug in sentences and it would spit out a toxicity score, and you could set confidence intervals for how in their own papers they would describe how useful this tool would be to be able to set confidence levels to automatically pre-censor anything with a confidence level above a 0.85. It's a 0 to 1 scale. It's the same way chess computers work, where the engine spits out a number and that tells you who's winning. So negative 2.7 would say that the computer assesses black to be winning by 2.7 pawns. It's basically, and you can do the same thing with, whether or not a sentence or a paragraph or a podcast violates a terms of service policy around mail-in ballots or COVID skepticism or glorification of Ukraine forces. Or you can plug and play to be able to create a deep blue to kick the even the most eloquent Garry Kasparov of like political populism eloquence. And when I saw this in late 2016, I immediately had a panic attack that like changed the rest of my life, because it was so evident, having lived through the chess world, that everybody thought at the time, they were like, Benz, no, we'll just change the word. If they say, you can't say Trump we'll just spell Trump with 2 R's and an F at the end, and they'll never catch us. And it's like, that's the same thing everyone was saying in the chess thing. Like, you are not going to be able to outrun an airplane. Like this, the money was rushing into it. The Pentagon was rushing into it. The CIA was rushing into it. Google was rushing into it. It was a gold mine. And you're sitting here, as an edgy thinking that, you're going to be able to joke your way out. So anyway, so I became very obsessive on the technological front, and that led me sort of hand in glove to the institutional sort of front. So I was very well aware of all this by the time I got to the State Department. I was screaming about it, well before, I was, I had the privilege to be there. But what I'll say is, because I did not have a traditional path into the State Department, I did not base my career and my principles and my friendships and my network on that path out of the State Department. Most people they are of the blob by the time they get to a position like that within the blob. You get groomed in this business. You work your way up. You go to a high-end white shoe university, then you are either you take the tech path through Google, or you take the political path through the Hill, or you take the human rights path through a UN job, or through a gongo, government operated NGO. And then you get credentialed through the think tanks. You get your fellowships at Carnegie or Atlantic Council or Brookings. And then, you have some sort of, low level political job, or you become, a career or foreign service. By that point, the woman you marry is probably, a blob creature. The people you're hanging out with on weekends are blob creatures. Everything, your news sources are all blob publications, and the money just, first of all, it's glitzier than everything else on the other side. The cocktail party invitations, everything, you are, nary a hit piece will ever be written about you in the New York Times or the Washington Post. Every golden turd you lay on the sidewalk will be deified as being, abstract art instead of an actual piece of crap. Like it's like what I imagine a manic high is like, extended over decades, because you think you're doing the Lord's work because everyone's telling you are, and you think you're being told it's patriotic because you are advancing the United States federal government's, diplomacy apparatus, or our national security, or the CIA is our first line of defense. I mean, this is what they say. It should be the last line, frankly, but they call it the first line. So some combination of money, social network, Clockwork Orange, ideological saturation, and the fear of losing it all. I mean, I can see why there is so little dissent within the blob. And part of this it was the great struggle of the Trump administration around staffing. But part of this is also that for there to really be an alternative, there needs to be an institutional alternative. There needs to be some place you can go after the State Department if you go against an Atlantic Council consensus from your desk there. There needs to be a robust civil society sector within, populist movements or independent movements. There needs to be a robust sort of university center enclave, a robust private sector commercial or even state government. There's this institutional capacity building that needs to happen to have a fighting chance. And who knows, maybe with people like Elon Musk and a lot of new people who've come along, into this in the past 2 years, that might have a shot. But, those people are on a hit list, between lawsuits and ad boycotts to try to cripple their capacities. So, it's going to be a 100-year war.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think of Thucydides talks about why nations go to war, and it's because of fear, honor, or interest. In this case, it seems like these people go to war against their fellow countrymen for all those three reasons at the same time. You mentioned fear of losing it all, gaining honor within a particular enclave, and then interest that, money, fame, whatever that gives me, a shiny, uh, desk, your name on a desk that's prestigious or whatever. It's kind of sickening.
Yeah,
honestly.
it sounds like status is a huge piece of that too.
Yeah.
So now current present day landscape, what are you thinking about? Obviously we're coming up, next year's an election year, but what's on your radar in the censorship landscape right now?
Well, everything, it's a multi-front, offensive that's needed. So you need legal. There's multiple lawsuits, in the works. There's a Supreme Court case which could frankly decide the entire architecture of how pieces on the chessboard can even move next year, which is before the Supreme Court now. I have an amicus brief that I submitted on that, and the Missouri State Attorney General's office is doing a fantastic job. I'm optimistic that Clarence Thomas will never be so unleashed on a nefarious government overreach than this one. But the extent, I don't doubt some positive resolution, but the extent of it is going to be where the magic is. It's one thing to kill coordination at the government level. It's a whole nother thing to go after the pass-throughs and cutouts in that relationship. And my fear is a Solomon splitting the baby, which could result in the censorship industry actually being more resilient, because everything will move through these cutouts. And frankly, we have the best fact pattern in this case that we'll ever have. These people are never again going to make the mistake of saying direct quotes like we're not allowed by law to do this, so we set up this separate thing to do it, and that thing goes on to describe how the tech companies themselves would not have adopted these censorship platforms without their pressure and without their threatening government pressure. I mean, it's like, if you've ever seen that confession skit from Key and Peele, where the rap guy is sitting before the New York Police Department investigator, and they're playing back a rap tape of everything that's needed to convict this person, all the way down to his alibi at Red Lobster being pre-announced and everything like that. We will never again have these people so dead to rights. So good facts make good law. Bad facts make bad law. There's, I think, a majority on the court who should be sympathetic to this. It should be 9-0. But the fact, if with this court at this fact pattern with this much political momentum, if we can't notch a very, very significant victory here, then the strategy is going to be very different going forward than if that can be leveraged. But look, you got legal, you got regulatory, not just at Congress itself. And it's not just a presidential election next year, it's a Senate one as well. And a Senate victory would be very powerful to be able to actually have bills passed. Right now, there's things that you can do in appropriations. There's things you can do on funding, but you can't get bills passed around censorship, because the Senate is never going to ratify that. With turnover in the Senate, these things become possible. But then you also have regulatory stuff happening at the state level. You have multiple anti-censorship state statutes being set up for sort of civilian freedom, cyber Bill of Rights type stuff. You have this in Florida, you have this in Texas. There's 6 or 7 other states who are interested in this, creating private rights of action. I think there's a lot that can be done at the state government level. You have the media level. I mean, the fact is as much as has already been exposed, we're still at the tip of the iceberg level. And there's a ton of stuff that I'm going to be doing the next year that I'm hugely excited about, but I almost don't want to talk about it just to not put it out there, before it's out. But no, this thing is going to blow up in the next year. And I think, the question is what happens when they raise the stakes? Jim Jordan had a subpoena into the Stanford Internet Observatory for the gold mine of all federal censorship collusion documents between the Department of Homeland Security, the intelligence services, their top cutouts. It's all being housed at the Stanford Internet Observatory. Jim Jordan's weaponization committee specifically subpoenaed it. Stanford said, you know what, we're not turning it over. Go F yourself. Jim Jordan has like threatened to like subpoena enforcement, but like I don't know where that ends up. Is this Justice Department, which is indicting the leading opposition candidate for like 1,000 years in prison in 4 different cases right now, and which has screwed over systematically? It's totally thrown off the yoke of nonpartisanship. I mean, is this Justice Department going to enforce subpoenas or contempt orders for people who defy congressional? I mean, this is the House Judiciary Committee. They're supposed to be the oversight of the Justice Department. But Frankenstein's monster is now completely taken over. So they've escalated it to rule of law, which has completely broken every tacit agreement we've all understood about how our own government works. But what do you do about that? This is a brand new world. Will they sustain it? Frankly, I think a critical mass of them are going to need to defect, or will need to be wedged, for them to put down that weapon. But this is the sort of stuff that true authoritarian countries do, that the State Department complains about. And the reason they complain is because it's unstoppable. If you really do have a closed society where like the military and the courts and like everything is so rigged against political opposition, you can't even start a political opposition movement. This is why the CIA hates them, because they can't pop up their own opposition movements. But we have like a totally organic thing here, and they're basically doing what they accused Saddam Hussein, Yanukovych, Gaddafi of. But Merrick Garland is doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said right. I think they're raising the stakes on their end. Biden just had this executive order against or about regulating AI, and how basically there has to be equitable outcomes and there were other sub documents, cutouts, if you would, explaining how compute power at a certain threshold and above has to be. I mean, just absolutely insane stuff. And then I was reading an article that Biden watched. The new Mission Impossible movie, which has a bad AI, that the enemy is AI. And after watching that movie, he was even more scared of AI. And then he drafted this executive order. You're like, this is clown world. This is insane. What do you think so you kind of describe right now the path to, at least not victory, but the path over the next couple of years on our side. What do you think their winning condition is, their winning state? If their ideal winning condition, what does that look like on that side?
There's 3 ways. One is rule of law. That is a great example right now is this Digital Services Act in the EU, which I personally worked on at state. This thing is a monstrosity, but it compels censorship of disinformation all across the European Union. This is like 450 million people who are going to be subject. X might not be able to operate in the European Union. I mean, think about what that will do to the platform if something like that happens. The entire global connectivity of X, which is arguably its like top value proposition. Like you get to go on X and see what Imran Khan, is. I mean, he's got Imran Khan, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, is one of the largest accounts. You have like hot wars being semi-negotiated with Twitter. You had the Ayatollah and the UK, the Israeli ministries, like memeing, in an actual hot meme war. But you have this big interlinkage between political parties across on the transatlantic side. There's a big overlap between Brexit coalition, the Brexit coalition in the UK and the MAGA coalition in the US. And a lot of that, they would retweet each other. They would amplify each other. The reason you get 200,000 views on your YouTube video with Nigel Farage chewing out Herman Van Rompuy as a low-grade bank clerk, well, like 150,000 of those views may be coming from the US, from people who just want to, see a Bulgarian barbarian, put his arm through the net in a shack dunk on international institutions. But you don't get that interlinkage if if X is not allowed to, if you can't be on that platform. Now they've got various leverage points there. For example, like something I've talked about a lot is this idea of middleware, which is this whole sort of intelligence-backed, Pentagon-backed, State Department-backed sweep sweeping set of censorship mercenary firms like NewsGuard and Global Disinformation Index and Check My Ads and all these technically non-governmental credibility rating and disinformation tracking, private sector tools and firms who are already billing themselves as providing disinformation compliance services for government regulations in the EU. Having seen this movie play out in so many other sectors, I suspect that the move they're going to play here is to say, listen, Elon, you don't want to, you got a great company, you spent a lot of money on it. It'd be a shame if something happened to it where you got severed off from all of Europe. If we'll allow you to simply, comply with the Digital Services Act if you simply engage one of 6 or 7, approved credentialing institutions who will do you run your company, add your premium services, add video, audio play, and add payments and whatever. But this one thing, disinformation compliance, we're going to need a firm, or a group within the company, like the Aaron Roderick's group, a cell that will simply just outsource it to them and then go back to sleep. Sweet dreams. Run your $1 billion company. No, it's just disinformation. It's not a big deal. And then through that, they will reinstall the same apparatus to rig every election on the planet as they had in their golden age from 2018 to 2022. I suspect that's what we're moving to. You see the same thing with the UK online harms bill, which is outside the EU, but it's the UK's version of it. Australia's got this new misinformation bill. Canada, they're doing this surround sound of rule of law censorship predicates that will, I think, that's the thing I'm most concerned about, because there are other paths to victory. There's ways of fighting it at the political and at the persuasion level. I mentioned there were 3 at the top of this. One of them is a rule of law. You're just a friggin' authoritarian, despot, and you just win because you control the army and the courts. And the 2 other ways are like institutional capture, if they can, just get the companies to just go along willingly. And it's not just X, by the way, and Elon Musk who are pushing back on that now. I think when Elon took over, it actually emboldened some of the other tech companies. Jack Dorsey made a public statement that he didn't want to kick Trump off Twitter. He did it because of business necessity, because they were going to bankrupt Twitter 1.0 through ad boycotts if they didn't censor, who they wanted. So civil society encirclement is the other path to victory for them, where if they surround free speech platforms like X or like Rumble with enough civil society institutions, they swarm them with, the Biden administration is paying about $50 million to 60 different U.S. colleges and universities, all working on censorship, all for their own proprietary centers, which go into these feeders to pressure X to kill the accounts that they flag, to kill the emerging narratives on all these issues. So, you're surrounded by 60 universities there. You're surrounded by probably 100 different State Department NGOs, all significantly influential in their own rank. You're surrounded by about 3 dozen, private sector censorship mercenary firms. You're surrounded by about, 70 or so different, fact-checking organizations who also provide pressure from that. And you're surrounded by 7 or 8 government agencies who are all involved in censorship, pressure, coordination, funding, or outsourcing in some way. So you're surrounding the whole corporate entity. And the winning condition for them is to simply bring the tech companies to heel via getting them to change their business model. I mean, if you can kill their ads and the company will go under, then you have a leveraging chip to say, okay, well, listen, the ads will come rushing back the moment you put our people in for censoring. You bring back the Aaron Roderick's team. You bring in our computer science people who are going to write your machine learning code on election integrity. You bring in these disinformation compliance people, and all good. Suddenly, the global the GARM and the World Advertisers Federation, and suddenly you'll be back in their good graces, and you'll have a high NewsGuard credibility score, and you'll be in good standing in the European Union. All of your business problems will go away if you do what the government wants you to do. I mean, it's basically a destabilization strategy on par with how we do economic sanctions to destabilize Syria or Cuba or Venezuela or, Libya. I mean, you get a swarm of international institutions. You get the media on board, you get the private sector money flowing in to pump it up, and you get sanctions to cut off all of their little alliances. That's why institutional capacity building is so important for us, because they know that is the thing that inoculates you from that tactic. So right now, we're in the thick of trench warfare of the capacities of the censorship industry and the capacities of institutions supporting free speech online.
Mike, thank you so much. You've been super generous with your time. Where can people follow you and follow the fight?
You can find me on Twitter at MikeBenzCyber, and our foundation is foundationforfreedomonline.com. And looking forward to talking soon.
Awesome.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks so much, Mike. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.